The airport was busy that afternoon. Travelers moved in every direction, dragging their suitcases, grabbing snacks, checking screens for flight numbers. It was just another day at Dallas International. Marcus Thompson, a quiet but powerful tech CEO, was traveling with his wife and their 13-year-old son, Jordan. They were headed to New York for a short family trip, something they hadn't done in months because of Marcus's tight work schedule. This time, he made sure to clear his calendar. All he wanted was a few peaceful days with his family. Jordan was excited. He loved flying and always asked to sit near the window. He wore his favorite hoodie and carried a small backpack with snacks, headphones, and his tablet. He didn't like attention, but anyone could see he was well-mannered and respectful. As they approached the gate, the airline staff smiled and greeted them. Everything seemed normal. They were flying first class, not because they needed to show off, but because Marcus always made sure his family was comfortable, especially on longer flights. When they boarded the plane, things changed a little. The flight attendant at the front of the first-class cabin, a woman named Kelly, gave them a quick look. She smiled at other passengers, but barely nodded at the Thompsons. Jordan noticed it, but he didn't say anything. Marcus caught the moment too, but stayed calm. He believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. They found their seats and settled in. Jordan took the window seat, his mom sat in the middle, and Marcus sat by the aisle. The flight was supposed to be about 3 hours long. Jordan looked out the window as the plane started to fill up. He liked watching the ground crew move around with their carts and orange vests. Kelly passed by to check seatbelts and hand out menus. When she reached their row, she asked the woman behind them if she needed anything but didn't say a word to the Thompsons. Instead, she just nodded and walked away. Jordan looked up at his dad, confused. Marcus gave him a small smile and said, "Just relax, buddy. Enjoy the ride." A few minutes later, as the plane was preparing for takeoff, Kelly returned with drinks. She gave a soda to the man across the aisle and orange juice to the couple in front. When she got to Jordan, he politely said, "Excuse me, I'm allergic to peanuts. Can I have apple juice instead of the snack?" Kelly didn't answer. She just looked at him, blinked, and moved on. Jordan leaned back in his seat, unsure of what just happened. Marcus glanced at his wife. They both saw it, but again he chose not to react. Yet, he believed the best way to handle uncomfortable moments was with patience and observation. But what he didn't know was that this wasn't the last strange moment on that flight. In fact, things were just getting started. The plane was now in the air, climbing smoothly above the clouds. Passengers had settled in, some reading, some watching movies, and a few already trying to nap. Jordan looked out the window, watching the clouds float past. He was still thinking about how the flight attendant, Kelly, had acted earlier. He hadn't done anything wrong, but she treated him like he was a problem. After about 20 minutes, Kelly came down the aisle again with the snack cart. When she got to their row, Jordan sat up and politely spoke. "Excuse me," he said softly. "I'm allergic to peanuts. Do you have anything without nuts?" Kelly didn't even look at him. She placed a snack bag on his tray table and said, "This is what we have." Marcus leaned forward a little. "He has a nut allergy," he repeated calmly. "We just want to make sure he's safe." Kelly let out a loud sigh. A few passengers nearby looked up from their screens. She crossed her arms and said, "We're all busy. I don't have time for special requests every 5 minutes." Jordan shrank into his seat. He hadn't meant to cause any trouble. He just didn't want to eat something that would make him sick. His mom gently moved the snack aside and whispered to him, "It's okay, don't eat it." Marcus gave a small nod and stayed quiet. He didn't want to create a scene. He believed that sometimes silence said more than words. But things didn't stop there. A little while later, Jordan unbuckled his seatbelt to reach up to the overhead bin. He had forgotten to take out his tablet before the flight started. He stood up quietly and opened the bin. Kelly suddenly appeared beside him, speaking sharply. "What are you doing? You're not allowed to be up right now." Jordan was surprised. He looked around. Other passengers were also up, stretching or grabbing things. No one else had been stopped. "I just needed my tablet," he explained. "You're being disruptive," she snapped. "Sit down now." Before he could respond, she reached out and slapped the tablet from his hands. It hit the seat and bounced to the floor. As she swung, her hand brushed his face. The entire cabin went silent. Jordan stood frozen, shocked. His eyes widened, and he looked at his dad. Marcus slowly stood up. He didn't yell. He didn't point. He simply looked at Kelly and then reached for his phone. He dialed a number and said quietly, "I need to report an incident. Please document this now." Kelly rolled her eyes and walked away. She muttered under her breath, "Kids these days." Passengers began whispering. Someone pulled out their phone. Others looked uncomfortable. Jordan sat down, still shaken. Marcus stayed calm. He didn't raise his voice, but behind his calm expression, something had changed. What he had just witnessed wasn't something he could ignore. And the flight was far from over. Jordan sat still in his seat, holding back tears. His hands were resting in his lap, and his eyes stayed on the floor where his tablet had landed. His mother gently picked it up and placed it back in his backpack without saying a word. Marcus stayed standing. He looked around the cabin. The mood had shifted. People who had seen what happened were whispering to each other. A woman 2 rows ahead leaned back and gave a small nod to Marcus, showing quiet support. A man across the aisle looked concerned and took out his phone, starting to type something. Marcus didn't say much. He took out his phone and calmly made a second call. "Yes, this is Marcus Thompson," he said. "We're on flight 482 from Dallas to New York. There's been an incident involving a crew member and my son. Please begin the report. I'll send details once we land." His voice was steady, calm, and serious. The way he spoke made it clear that this wasn't the first time he had to handle a difficult situation. But this one was personal. As he hung up the phone, the co-pilot stepped out of the cockpit. He quietly spoke to Kelly at the front of the cabin. She frowned, clearly confused, and looked back toward Marcus. She had started to realize something was happening, but she still didn't know who Marcus was. Kelly walked down the aisle again, pretending everything was fine. She picked up trash from other passengers and smiled like nothing had happened. When she reached the Thompsons, she didn't speak. She just passed by quickly. Jordan stared out the window, still trying to stay strong. His mother gently held his hand under the tray table. Marcus sat back down but didn't relax. He glanced at his watch and checked his phone. Messages were already coming in. Behind them, a few passengers had written short notes about what they had seen. One woman was even typing a formal complaint on her phone, ready to send it to the airline the moment the plane landed. What happened to Jordan wasn't just an accident. It was seen by many, and it wasn't going to be forgotten. In the back of the plane, another flight attendant noticed the tension and whispered to Kelly, "What's going on?" Kelly shrugged. "Just a spoiled kid and his parents making noise," she said. "They're probably just trying to get free stuff." But the truth was far from that. Marcus wasn't angry. He didn't yell or argue. He didn't ask for anything. He just made a call. A quiet call that was already starting to cause waves on the ground. And as the plane continued through the sky toward New York, a few people on board started to realize something. This wasn't just another flight anymore. As the plane moved through the sky, the mood inside the cabin stayed quiet, but there was an odd feeling in the air. People could tell something serious had happened, even if they hadn't seen it themselves. Some passengers whispered softly. Others kept checking their phones, even though there was no signal yet. Marcus looked calm, but his mind was working fast. He had made just one call, and that was enough. It wasn't a call for help. It was a call for action. The person on the other end didn't ask many questions. They simply said, "Understood," and began doing their job. Jordan stayed close to his mother, still quiet. He wasn't scared, but he was confused. He didn't understand why the flight attendant had treated him that way. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had followed the rules, spoken politely, and even said thank you. Marcus leaned over to him and whispered, "You did everything right. Just stay calm. Everything will be handled." Near the front of the plane, Kelly stood near the snack area, pretending to organize drinks. But she kept glancing back toward the Thompsons. She had noticed the way other passengers were looking at her now. Something was different. She didn't know exactly what was going on, but she felt uneasy. A few minutes later, the co-pilot came out of the cockpit again. This time, he spoke quietly with another crew member. Then he went back inside and closed the door behind him. That's when Kelly's radio buzzed. "Head to the cockpit," the captain's voice said. She walked quickly to the front and stepped inside. The door closed behind her. Inside, the captain explained that they had received a message from air traffic control. They had been told to expect a security team at the gate when they landed in New York. The message didn't give many details, but it mentioned a possible incident with a crew member. The captain had asked if anyone on the flight had reported a disturbance, but nothing official had come through the airline system yet. Kelly's face changed. She still tried to act confused, but deep down, she started to worry. "Are you sure it's about this flight?" she asked. The captain gave her a look. "They used this flight number, and they asked for names. Yours was one of them." Back in the cabin, Marcus checked his phone again. He had received confirmation that his call had been taken seriously. Several steps were already in motion. Once they landed, the right people would be waiting. Passengers nearby looked at him with quiet respect. They didn't know who he was, but they could tell he had done something important. By the way, if you like stories like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. There's more coming. As the plane flew closer to New York, one thing was clear. The moment it touched the ground, this flight would not end like any other. And Kelly was starting to realize that her actions had consequences. As the plane neared New York, passengers began to gather their things, preparing for landing. The seatbelt signs flashed on, and the crew moved quickly down the aisles, making sure everyone was ready for the descent. But something felt off. There was a tension in the air, a quiet unease that lingered among the passengers. Marcus remained calm, but his eyes kept scanning the cabin. His mind was still focused on the next steps. Jordan was flipping through his tablet, trying to distract himself from the uncomfortable energy that seemed to surround him. His mother, however, noticed the small signs of unease in the passengers around them. Some whispered to each other, others simply watched the flight attendants more closely than usual. Kelly, still at the front of the plane, was doing her best to act normal. She went about her duties with a forced smile, handing out final drinks and checking seatbelts. But the longer she moved through the cabin, the more she realized the passengers were watching her. The co-pilot had returned to the cockpit, and Kelly was left alone with the few remaining duties. She had to pass by the Thompsons' row one last time. This time, however, when she looked at Marcus, her smile faltered. He didn't return it. His eyes were calm but sharp, as if he was already looking beyond the flight, to the moments after it landed. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening. Her radio buzzed again, this time with a message from the captain. "Prepare for arrival. Security will meet us at the gate." Kelly's heart skipped a beat. Security. She knew that wasn't just routine. But what had she done wrong? She thought back to the incident with Jordan, but surely it couldn't be that serious. She had dealt with worse situations before, and nothing like this had ever happened. The plane touched down smoothly, the engines slowing as they made their way toward the gate. Passengers began to gather their things, chatting quietly among themselves. The usual buzz of excitement filled the cabin, but there was still an undercurrent of uncertainty. Marcus stood up first, gathering his family's things. He moved calmly, but his steps were purposeful. Jordan followed closely behind, still a little nervous, though he trusted his father's quiet strength. As the plane came to a complete stop at the gate, the passengers noticed something unusual. Several uniformed officers were standing near the entrance, waiting. They weren't there to greet the passengers. They were there to speak with the flight crew. The captain stepped out from the cockpit, nodding toward the officers. The moment the plane door opened, the officers began boarding, their eyes scanning the passengers, but their focus was on the crew. Kelly stood frozen for a moment, watching as the officers walked past her. She didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but she felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Marcus, however, remained calm, his focus still on his family, but he couldn't ignore what was unfolding. The tension in the air was undeniable. Something had changed, and as the officers reached the front of the plane, it was clear. The moment of truth had arrived. As the plane's door opened, the cool air of New York hit the passengers. The flight attendants stepped back, and the usual buzz of travelers grabbing their bags began. But today, there was something different in the air. The crew noticed the officers standing just inside the gate, watching them closely. Marcus didn't make a scene as he gathered his family's belongings. He moved calmly, as though the situation were completely normal, even though his mind was fully aware of what was about to happen. He had handled many difficult situations before, but this was different. This wasn't about business or work. It was about making sure his son was safe. Kelly, still standing near the front of the cabin, felt a cold wave of panic. She had seen the officers and knew this wasn't just routine security. Her hands felt clammy, and her thoughts raced as the passengers slowly made their way toward the exit. She caught sight of the officers moving toward her, and a knot tightened in her stomach. "Flight Attendant Kelly," one of the officers asked, his voice calm but firm. She nodded, her throat dry. "Please step this way." The officer didn't shout. He didn't pull her aside angrily, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in his voice. Kelly followed him, her legs feeling heavier with each step. She glanced at the other flight attendants, who looked at her with a mix of confusion and concern. They had no idea what was going on either. Marcus was already stepping into the aisle with his family. As they walked toward the exit, he caught sight of the officers speaking to Kelly. His expression remained calm, though his eyes narrowed slightly as he noticed the attention being directed at her. He didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't feel angry. He just knew that the right thing was happening. As they stepped off the plane, the cool breeze outside felt like a change. The airport terminal was bustling, but the officers were focused entirely on the crew. Marcus and his family moved smoothly through the terminal, their footsteps quiet as the officers led Kelly toward a private area. Jordan glanced back, still not fully understanding the seriousness of what had just happened. He hadn't done anything wrong. He just wanted a safe flight. But his father's quiet confidence reassured him. Whatever came next, he knew they were on the right side of things. The moment they stepped into the terminal, Marcus turned to his family. "Let's just get through security, and we'll grab something to eat. Everything's going to be fine." As they passed through security, they could hear bits and pieces of conversations behind them. Some passengers were speaking about what had happened, others were just asking questions. A few had even quietly recorded what had occurred, and the story was already spreading among the crowd. Marcus didn't care about the attention. He cared about justice. He cared about making sure something like this didn't happen again. In the midst of the noise and the rush of the airport, Marcus remained calm. The story wasn't over yet, but the first step had been taken, and he knew the outcome would be worth it. The day passed in a blur. After leaving the airport, Marcus and his family went to their hotel in New York. The quiet of their room was a relief after the tense moments at the airport, but Marcus couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. By the time they had dinner, Marcus had received several calls. The airline had reached out to apologize, but that didn't satisfy him. They promised an investigation, but he didn't trust it would be thorough unless he pushed for it. So he called the airline's customer service department, his tone serious and firm. "I want to speak to someone higher up," he said calmly. "This is not just about a mistake. This is about an employee who treated my son poorly and caused unnecessary stress. I need to make sure this is handled correctly." The voice on the other end promised to have someone higher up call them back soon, but Marcus wasn't convinced. He knew the system sometimes took time to react, but he wasn't willing to wait for a slow response. Meanwhile, Kelly's day had been anything but easy. After the officers had spoken to her, she had been taken aside for questioning. The airline's internal investigation team had also gotten involved. She had to explain her actions on the flight, but she couldn't deny what had happened. She had been caught in the wrong. While the officers didn't arrest her, they had made it clear that her behavior wasn't acceptable. She was told to stay in New York and wait for further instructions from the airline's Human Resources Department. The tension of the day weighed heavily on her, but it wasn't the only thing on her mind. She had heard murmurs about how the story was spreading. Passengers had already shared their experience, and her actions were being questioned online. The thought of facing possible disciplinary action made her stomach turn, but she had only herself to blame. She hadn't thought about the consequences of her actions in the moment. All she had done was react. But now she was facing the reality of it. Back at the hotel, Marcus sat with his wife, discussing the next steps. They knew that this wasn't just about one flight or one employee. This was about creating awareness for situations like the one they had experienced. They didn't want any other child to feel unsafe or unimportant on a flight. They didn't want any other parent to have to fight for their child's dignity. The next morning, Marcus received the call he had been waiting for. It was from a senior manager at the airline. "Mr. Thompson, I want to personally apologize for what happened on your flight. We are taking your complaint seriously, and a full investigation is already underway. We will keep you updated on the results." Marcus nodded, but he knew this was just the start. He was determined to see it through. His focus wasn't just on justice for his family. It was about ensuring that the airline would make changes so that nothing like this could happen again. As he hung up, he looked at his wife and said, "We've started something. Now we finish it." Several days passed, and Marcus and his family stayed in New York while they awaited updates from the airline. The tension had eased, but the weight of what had happened still lingered in the back of their minds. Every time they thought the situation was behind them, something new came up. On the morning of the fourth day after the incident, Marcus received a call from the airline. This time, it was from the airline's chief officer. "Mr. Thompson, I want to thank you for your patience. We've completed our investigation, and I'm here to discuss the results with you." Marcus sat up straight. He had been expecting this call, but hearing it was different. It felt like a moment of closure was finally on the horizon. "We've reviewed the entire situation carefully," the officer continued. "Kelly has been taken off active duty while we address her actions. In addition to the disciplinary measures, we're also taking steps to ensure that something like this never happens again." Marcus listened closely. The tone of the conversation was formal, but there was a sense of sincerity in the officer's voice. He could tell they weren't just brushing the issue aside. "We are also offering you a formal apology from the airline," the officer added. "We understand that the experience was traumatic, and we want to make things right. Please know that we are committed to training our staff to handle all passengers with the respect they deserve." Marcus felt a mix of emotions: relief, frustration, and even a small sense of justice. It wasn't enough to undo what had happened, but it was a step in the right direction. He had fought for his son's dignity, and now the airline was acknowledging the mistake. "Thank you," Marcus replied. "I appreciate the steps you're taking, but I want to make sure this goes beyond just one incident. I want to know that the airline is going to put in place lasting changes." The officer assured him that this was just the beginning. They were reviewing their policies and would be making improvements to their training programs to prevent discrimination and ensure all passengers were treated fairly. Marcus felt a small sense of hope that this might spark real change. As Marcus ended the call, he turned to his family. "This isn't over, but it's a start," he said, his voice steady. "We've made sure that something good can come from this." That afternoon, Marcus spoke with a few of the passengers who had witnessed the incident. They expressed their support and admiration for how he had handled the situation. Word had spread, and many people had been touched by his calm and determined approach. Marcus wasn't seeking praise, but hearing that others recognized what he had done brought him a sense of peace. The Thompsons stayed in New York for a few more days, enjoying the city and reflecting on everything that had happened. They had come there for a vacation, but it had turned into something much more important, an opportunity to fight for fairness and ensure that future passengers, especially children, would be treated with the respect they deserved. As they boarded their return flight home, Marcus glanced around the plane. He couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. This time, it was peaceful, and he knew that the small steps they had taken had helped make sure that flights in the future would be safer and more welcoming for everyone.